Welcome back everyone to another video. Today we're going to talk about pfSense and specifically talking about pfBlocker. So pfBlocker is a package for pfSense that allows you to add IP block lists and country block functions to a pfSense firewall or router. It basically is a must-have for anyone who has pfSense. You may be running Pi-hole as well on your network. And what that does is that allows you to block ads and has a really nice user interface. So we won't be going into Pi-hole today, but pfSense has a very, very similar function where you can not only block ads, but you can also block different IPs, domains, or even block countries from a geo-IP database into getting into your network. If that sounds interesting, then let's get started. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to install the pfBlocker package. Now, as of version 2.4.5 release P1, this is not a package that's installed by default into pfSense. Pretty much no packages are. At one point it might be part of the normal pfSense config, but for now we're going to have to install it. So in order to do that, we go ahead and go to System, Package Manager, Available Packages, and we're going to type pfBlocker. And you're going to see two different versions here. You're going to see pfBlockerNG and pfBlockerNG Dnsbl. Now this is the development version of pfBlocker, and normally I would recommend going with the stable version. However, pfBlockerNG Dnsbl has had a lot of development into it and gotten to the point where it's very stable, and I highly recommend that you download this version instead of the pfBlockerNG version. So we're going to go ahead and install that. It's going to take probably 10-15 seconds or so in order to install it. Alright, it's done. And you're going to see pfBlockerNG Dnsbl is now installed. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and configure pfBlocker. Alright, so now that you have pfBlockerNG installed, we're going to go ahead and configure it. So I'm going to go to Firewall, pfBlockerNG, and you're greeted by this nice wizard, which we could go through and it would set a couple settings up for you. I'm personally going to skip it. I'm going to click here to exit. Alright, so now you're greeted with the General tab here of pfBlockerNG. So you're going to notice you have a couple settings here. This is just enabling or disabling it. We can go ahead and enable it. All of this is fine. You want to keep your settings. The cron settings telling you how often you want to update pfBlocker. So in this case, it's every hour. That's totally fine. No limit for download failure threshold. Okay. I found all of this to be by default. So we're going to go ahead and hit save. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to go over to IP. So in IP, now what we're doing is we're setting any IPs that we want to block. So if you look in this tab, you're going to see things like you have your placeholder address. This is something different than what's in your network. So you notice it shows 127.1.7.7. It's fine. Whatever is here is okay as long as this is not something that's used in your network. You want it to be a placeholder IP that basically goes nowhere. Okay? So the next thing that you want to do is you want to go down to where it says max mine license key. This is if you want to use geo-IP. I can show in another video how you get this, but there's lots of guides on getting your own free maxmind key. This is something that's a little bit newer in pfSense as of late in order to do geo-IP blocking, but we're going to pretend we put something in there. Okay, so now you have your inbound and outbound firewall rules. We're going to talk about this for a second. So you notice that mine both show WAN, so you don't want this. This is because I only have one interface on this test build. And in your case, you are most likely going to have a WAN and LAN interface. You might have more interfaces depending on how many network interface cards or ports that you have, but more than likely you have WAN and LAN. And you're going to want inbound to say WAN and outbound to say LAN. And by default, you have block coming in and reject going out. Really, the only difference between these is if it logs or not. But by default, I keep these rules the way that they are. Okay, now you have to decide if you want these to be floating rules or not. I personally like them to be enabled, but this is really up to you. And the rest of this is fine, so we can go ahead and save. Okay, So the next thing we can go to underneath this tab is GeoIP. So this is what I was talking about before, where you can block entire countries and you can also block specific IPs. This is a really handy interface because if you want to say block the entire continent of Africa and you want to block Asia and Europe, things like that, depending on which continent you may be from, you might not want traffic from those places. So it's pretty easy that all you have to do is select the continent that you want and you can say you want it to be denied. So I'm going to say I want all traffic from Africa to be denied inbound and I want them to log as well. Now this means that I'm getting no traffic from the entire continent of Africa and I'm good to go. Personally, I'm from the US, so I want all of my traffic to be blocked except for North America. So I'm going to have all of these denied inbound. The top spammers line, you don't really have to worry about. It's kind of duplicative of the rest of these. It's just saying the top countries that it thinks are the ones that are spammers. So you could maybe just do this and then ignore the rest. But it doesn't really make too much of a difference if you decide to do both. It's really just an extra step. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to deny all of these inbound. Sure, all of that is good. And you can go into more detail if you want to and say that you want to select certain countries in here, but we're really not going to worry about that too much for now. So the next thing that you can do while you're in pfBlocker is you can go into Dnsbl or Dnsblock. So this is where you want to block different traffic coming from certain IPs or certain domain names. And so in order to enable that, click enable right here. This is if you want all subdomains to be blocked in TLD. So you want to be a little careful if you want to do that, but it's perfectly fine if you say I want everything from a certain domain to be blocked. Now we're going to keep going. You have the default blocked web page. You can create a custom one if you want, not a big deal, but by default you can leave that. Now here's your whitelist. So let's say you have DNS block on, but you want to not block certain things like Amazon ads, so you can use the Amazon app. Or if you want Google Analytics to run because it breaks other apps or things that IoT services may go through and you want to whitelist that. And you can go into this and you can add whatever domains that you want. So let's say if you want everything from S3, Amazon, AWS.com. Boom. Now that's whitelisted and that's already an entry. Or I want everything from GitHub.com. Now that's another thing that's whitelisted. So it makes it pretty easy. You can do the same thing with blacklists and you can go through and add as many of these as you want. The next thing you're going to want to do is you want to go into Dnsbl Groups. And this is where you're going to add multiple lists of ad sites that have been curated by others, and you're going to add those into separate groups. So you can either add them all into one group with many definitions, you can have many definitions with many groups, it's really up to you. And that's just depending on the settings for that group. So if you want them all to behave in the same way, to update at the same time, on the same day, you want them all to be enabled, it's fine to put them all in one group, but it's really however you want. So I'm going to name this ads. And again, you can really name this anything. This is just to help you determine what is going into this list. And the next thing is what your DNSBL source definition is. So this source definition is basically a curated list, usually in a text file, that has a massive list of different ad sites or ad domains that you want to block. And so the one thing that you have to be careful of is that sometimes these are sites that you want to be able to pass through because otherwise apps would fail. A big example of that is the Amazon app, where if you try to access it with a lot of these lists enabled, you're going to get the very common dog picture that comes up on the Amazon app because it needs certain ads to pass through. So if that is something that's important to you, then you'll have to go back to the previous page and add and whitelist certain domains that you want to pass through. But otherwise, it's pretty simple. So all you have to do is you just change the state to on, you put in your source of what you want, and you can get these sources from the web. So I'm going to put in a very common one here, addaway.org/hosts, and this is just a text file, and I will call this add away. Now if we go into this text file, I'll kind of give you an idea of what this looks like. So it is just a large text file of all of these different ad sites, and I mean a lot of them. So this kind of gives you the idea of how much work went into curating a site like this. And it's basically going to block this on your entire network, which is really cool. Okay, so again, we can add more sources here. We can get, different ad sites that we want. We can make our own. It's really up to you. But let's, for example's sake, say that we're just going to have this one source definition in here, and we're going to just change a couple of the settings. So let's scroll down. Action, we're going to change to unbound. Update frequency however you want. I like once a day. Whatever day that you want, all this is fine. And we're going to hit save. And that's it. So now that you've saved this configuration, you can go into update if you want this to update now. Otherwise, it's going to run every hour depending on however you set this up. And it will update and add those lists. And that brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully, I've given you some tips as far as how to get pfBlockerNG off the ground. There's a lot of different things that you can do in order to configure it and customize it to your liking. But this should at least get you to the point where you have some basic level of geo-IP blocking and ad blocking as well. Make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.